Welcome to Crawlspace.
Tonight we have an interview with Ryan from the Dean Murder Research Group, and he is an interesting member. What do you say, Lance?
Ryan is a human encyclopedia when it comes to the Dean murder, and he can tell the story and deliver the facts in an eloquent storytelling way, which makes for a captivating interview. He does a really good job of staying on track, and I think it struck me about halfway through that we were able to talk about this case, which has such an enormous amount of information, and it's got such history to it. There's such a historical element that you can certainly get lost in all of the facts, and there's a ton of characters, and you can really go down various rabbit holes. But we managed to stay on track. This is the first interview with him, and I can't wait till we get together with him again and get more focused on some of these details.
I keep finding myself surprised at how detailed the details are of this case. When we first started looking into it, I said, I'm not going to get that deep because I knew you knew all this information from looking into it back in your high school days and beyond. But I kind of stayed purposely surface level because I didn't think it was as deep as it is. And every new question, every new thought, every deep thought that I come up with or that I hear leads to a few other questions, and that genuinely surprises me about this case. And there's even a part in this interview where I started to get a little fired up, and it's something we should definitely address on future issues because it's going to come up more.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I was surprised during this interview when you did get a little worked up over some of these facts, and when you look back on the case, it's 1918. We're coming up on the 99th anniversary of the murder, and it still generates such strong feelings when you're talking about the details and the characters and potential lies and potential cover-ups. I just thought it was pretty cool to see you getting fired up on that, because we get fired up on current cases, and now we get fired up on this, almost a century-old case.
And it surprised me.
Yeah, as much as things change, they still stay the same. We always hear from our listeners, no matter what case we're working on, and one thing that I would like to hear about from the listeners, one thing that I'm curious about is how do you think this case would have gone down had it happened today? How fast would it have been solved? Just curious what kind of feedback and what the opinion is of the listeners.
Follow us on Twitter at CrawlspacePod and tell a friend. Thank you very much for listening. Welcome to Crawlspace, Ryan Mullahy. How are you this afternoon?
I'm good. Thanks for having me, guys.
Thanks for coming on. Appreciate it.
So you're part of the Dean Murder Research Group up in Jaffrey, New Hampshire, which is an organization that meets up there and they talk about this. And so how did you get into researching this case, and how did you find out about this murder research group?
Well, it's an interesting story. I was at the Keene Library doing unrelated historical research into the movie theaters in Keene, and I was in the vertical file they have with just odds and ends of different historical pamphlets and whatnot, and I came across a file that said Dean murder. And being a fan of CSI and cold case and things of that nature, I was intrigued. So I checked out the folder, and there was a few news clippings and a couple of pieces on the murder, just a little bit. So I was intrigued, and I immediately went home and looked it up online and found that there was a website that the Historical Society had put up and that they were starting a research group. So it was kind of lucky timing that right when I found it was right around when they were forming the group, and I reached out and just said, hey, I'm a local researcher, and this sounds really fascinating, and I'd love to get involved.
So you discovered the Dean murder while doing an independent research on old movie theaters. So it was an accidental discovery. You had never heard about the Dean murder before?
Never heard of it before. It was a complete accidental discovery just at the library looking through the file, and he immediately was intrigued. And then at the time, there wasn't as much stuff on the website, so I tried to consume everything I could online, and then I met with the group and ended up getting involved.
What was the file that you found? What was its contents?
It was just like a library vertical file, so there was some articles that had been clipped from over the years from newspapers. Being such a famous local case, the Keene Sentinel, every so many decades or on the anniversary, would do kind of historic reviews of the case. So there was a few of those, nothing really revelatory, just some basic local clippings in there.
You called yourself a local researcher. Tell us a little bit about that and what your past experience in researching is.
I've been researching for about 20 years now. I've done research into a number of different areas. My main focus is New Hampshire and New Hampshire history. I like that subject, but I've also done, as a result of the Dean case, I've done a bit of research into World War I, military, the Air Force, a myriad of subjects, unidentified flying objects, military files in regards to UFO sightings. So everything from local history, movie theaters, World War I, to cold cases and local New Hampshire murders going back to the 1800s.
Recently, in our first episode of our Dean coverage, we heard from the Attorney General Oscar Young in his opening statements. And I was just wondering, we heard his description of how William Dean was murdered and how his body was found. Is there a description that you can provide to us?
Basically, Mr. Dean was beaten, strangled, tied up, bound. He was carried out to the cistern, which was by the large house on his property that he had rented, and a burlap bag and a large rock was placed in that bag and tied over his neck, and then he was dropped in the water.
And how much water was in that cistern?
I believe there was enough to cover him up, maybe 10 or 11 feet of water. I'm guessing, I don't remember off the top of my head.
Mr. Dean wasn't a very large man. Do you know what his size and weight was?
I would say he was a regular size to maybe slightly smaller man. He was very fit. In his earlier days, he was a boxer. He was known to be a great boxer in the area, and he was also known to lift weights. So he kept on up on his physique a bit when he was younger. Now, at the time of the murder, he was getting a little bit older, so he was getting a bit elderly at that point.
Bet he could still throw a punch, though.
Oh, I bet you he could.
Bet there are certain people, if we were back in that time, we could ask if Dean could still throw a punch, and which we will get to. We will get to in a little bit. I don't want to be overwhelming with information. I would like you to talk a little bit about where you're from. Are you from the area? And can you describe the area, how it is currently constituted? Also, the mountain ranges in the area, because we're going to end up discussing a lot about the area, what the murder did to the town, how it divided it, but also the geographic proportions of the area and how the alleged signal lights were delivered from that area to Boston Harbor.
Sure. Well, Jaffrey was a small village at the time, and there were a number of farms that are on the outskirts of Jaffrey that are on high elevation, so they afford a very good view towards Boston and the water. So a lot of the farms, including Mr. Dean's farm, were on a high elevation, a perfect place to be sending signals or doing that sort of activity. And then also you have Monadnock, which is right in the vicinity, which overlooks Jaffrey. And you can see Boston from there. And the first thing you see if you sail into Boston is Mount Monadnock. So it's a very visible object from the ocean, and it's also the tallest natural structure. As far as going from inland, so it's a key point.
Now, was it the theory at the time that the alleged signal lights, were started on Mount Monadnock and shined to the corresponding mountains to Boston Harbor?
Well, it's all just theories, but basically what happened was not too long after World War I started, there were reports all up and down the East Coast, including New Hampshire, Maine, of signal lights, unknown aircraft, wireless units, and different spy activity going on. And so lights started being seen in Jaffrey, in the Monadnock area, around 1916 and 1917. And so that was what started bringing the focus in the area there. But there's a number of different theories. Some of the theories are that they were shining signals from mountaintop to mountaintop and then relaying those signals out to submarines or boats that were out in Boston. That's one theory. The other theory is that they were just taking information and going directly to Monadnock and then signaling or sending wireless messages from Monadnock out to other people.
Are we sure this wasn't just World War I paranoia? Hysteria? Everyone's paranoid that their neighbor is a German?
Well, in this case, that was what was thought at the time. And even today, a lot of people still suspect that. But if we look at the history, which I've done as far as I've looked at the whole area of New England, starting from World War I, leading up to the murder, and there's a number of cases where people were caught signaling, wireless units were obtained, found. And so there seems to be enough evidence that there was definitely some sort of activity going on. But I think a lot of it was paranoia because people were so paranoid. So I think a lot of this stuff may have been just paranoia, or someone hears about the spy lights and then they see a light blinking in the distance and they think it's a spy light. So I think that there was a healthy amount of that going on at the time, but ultimately there were also a lot of incidents where there was a verified unknown plane, there was verified spy activity. So it's safe to say that there was a good amount of spy activity that was in fact going on.
And now a brief word from our sponsor, Casper. Casper is a sleep brand that created one perfect mattress sold directly to consumers, eliminating commission-driven inflated prices. Its award-winning sleep surface was developed in-house as a slick design and is delivered in a small, how did they do that, sized box. In addition to the mattress, Casper also offers an adaptive pillow and soft, breathable sheets.
What makes Casper so great? Is that what you asked me?
I didn't ask you anything.
Oh, you didn't? I could have sworn you said what makes it so great. Well, I'll just go ahead with this. It combines supportive memory foam to create an award-winning sleep surface with just the right sink, and I know you like this one, just the right bounce. You like just the right bounce.
Of course, who wouldn't? With over 20,000 reviews and an average of 4.8 stars, it's quickly becoming the internet's favorite mattress. And that's based on Amazon and Google reviews.
Free shipping in the US and Canada?
You got it.
I wish I could try it.
You wouldn't believe this. You can try it for 100 nights, risk-free, in your own home. And if you don't love it, Lance, which I know you will, they'll pick it up and refund you everything.
Could I try it for 100 nights in your home?
No.
So we have a special offer to the listeners of this show, right? You're going to get $50 toward any mattress purchase by visiting www.casper.com/crawl.
This offer is only applicable to the purchase of a mattress. Terms and conditions apply. So check out casper.com/crawl and get $50 towards any mattress purchase.
a good amount of legitimate concern, right, of spy activity and unknown activity up there, because there were federal agents in Jaffrey before William Dean's murder. That's accurate.
Oh, yes, that's accurate. Yeah, they started researching or investigating, I should say, the light signals or the alleged light signals in Jaffrey. I believe it was 1916 or 1917. So about a year or two before the murder occurred, they were already up there investigating the situation, the Department of Justice, and they were actually up there in the area researching the lights when the murder happened. So at least a year beforehand, they were in the area trying to figure out who was doing these things. And they were actually there right when the murder happened. So, and then that brought a whole other element to their investigation because they had already talked to Mr. Dean about the signal lights, and they had already suspected that his tenant, Lawrence Coffelt, may have been a German spy. So they had already talked to Mr. Dean at least once, and they were familiar with him, and he had given them his information that he had, which wasn't much at the time, but he was very much fascinated with the lights and was a very patriotic citizen. So he was more than happy to try and help them out and, help them figure out who was doing the lights and bring them to justice.
Now, you just mentioned a very interesting name in the whole case, Lawrence Coffelt. Mind giving a little background on him?
Well, Lawrence Coffelt was a mysterious gentleman who was from New York, originally from Philadelphia, but when he arrived in Jaffrey, he had come from New York, and he had lived in Jaffrey in 1916 at the Baldwin Farm, which was another farm similar to Mr. Dean's. He had lived there for a while, then moved back to New York, and then the end of the summer in 1917, he moved back to Jaffrey and rented the big house on Mr. Dean's property. So he came back for a second time to live in Jaffrey, and he stayed throughout the winter, which some people found suspicious because he was an out-of-towner, he was wealthy, and most out-of-towners only would come to Jaffrey for the summertime from Boston or different places. So that was one of the things people found a bit peculiar, that he wanted to be there through the winter. And so that's how he came to live at Mr. Dean's, is he decided to rent the farm there, and then that's how they started to interact with each other.
Mr. Dean asked Coffelt to leave his property a couple months before his murder. Is that related to his murder?
As I said, Coffelt moved in at the end of the summer or right around August, September of 1917. And so during that winter / spring, that was at the point where the DOJ came around and talked to Mr. Dean, and they were already suspecting Coffelt, so they asked some questions about what he thought of Coffelt. Now, at the time, Mr. Dean didn't have any reason to suspect Coffelt, so when they asked about Coffelt, he said, oh, yeah, he's a good American. And so, but what ended up happening was, as time went on, as things started to get closer and closer to the spring of 1918, Mr. Dean and Coffelt started to have some conflicts just about kind of the rental stuff, disputes about the bar, nothing to do with spy stuff. But in addition to that, Mr. Dean started to become suspicious as time went on that Coffelt could have been involved with the spy activity. So that's why right in the beginning of June, Mr. Dean asked Coffelt to move out of his property, because at that point he was very suspicious that Coffelt was involved with the spy activity. So at that point, he asked him to leave because he didn't want him living there.
And that's June of 1918, 2 months before the murder. And in that 2-month period, I feel like a lot of these suspicions started to culminate and really came to a head.
Do you know how old Coffelt was, and do you know what his stature was?
I believe he was early to mid-30s at the time. He was pretty athletic. I mean, he wasn't a big guy, but he was described as a pretty in shape guy. He was very mysterious because he was independently wealthy, and he was getting something like $1,000 a month from his mother, which was supposedly from like a trust fund, but that was one of the things that people always kind of found suspicious, whether or not that's where the money was actually coming from, or whether he was being paid as a spy to be there. So we know that much about him, that he was originally from Pennsylvania. He mainly lived in New York before coming to Jaffrey. And he was just really kind of a mysterious fellow, because at the time there was a law during World War I. You either need to be fighting or you need to be working, but he wasn't doing either at the time. And that's, we suspect that not long after he was asked to leave Mr. Dean's property, he went and secured a job at the Portsmouth Naval Yard, which is a little odd in the sense that he was staying in the fanciest hotel in Portsmouth, but then going off to the Naval Yard and, kind of working this very menial job. And he even alluded to people that he took the job because he was concerned that Mr. Dean or someone else, might get in trouble because he wasn't working or fighting. And there was a law at the time about that.
Was Coffelt actually German?
Well, there's been a lot of talk about that over the years. Initially, when the investigation was going on with the DOJ, there was some talk by them that he could have possibly been the son of von Bernstorff, who was the German ambassador to the United States and who was also ended up being heavily involved in German spy activity in the United States during World War I. But I don't think that was ever verified with information by the DOJ. That was something that they suspected, but I've never seen any documents that prove that. So there's the slight chance that could be true, but all indications are that he was Irish, I believe, of Irish and English descent.
I guess I used the wrong picture on the YouTube video then. I must have used the picture of Coffelt's dad.
Oh, yes, his father, the Reverend, yes. Okay. Yeah, because as far as I know, there are no photos of Coffelt at all that we have, and that's actually something that I've been on the lookout for, because it would be great to have a photo of everybody involved or the key people, and I have not been able to find a photo of Coffelt yet.
So as far as we know, there is no known photograph of Lawrence Coffelt, his daughter Natalie Coffelt, or Margaret Coffelt, his wife. All of them lived at the big house on Dean's property at the time, right?
As far as we know, there is no photo that we have so far of any of them.
And all three of them were living in the big house at the time?
They were.
I want to go back to the federal agents being in Jaffrey in 1916, 1917, and especially during the time of the murder. And I'm assuming that you're speaking literally, that they were in town during the time of the murder. During the day of the murder. Why did, and if that's the case, why did Dean confide in Mrs. Morrison on his property and requested her to go to Boston and bring back their best man when he already had men there?
Because the people knew in the area, they knew that the DOJ was up investigating, but the DOJ went through a lot of trouble to try and keep it under wraps as much as possible when they were up there, because of the nature of what they were doing. They were going up and interviewing people, and they were also spending a lot of nights outside observing the mountain, trying to actually physically go and catch the people that were doing this. So as far as Mr. Dean, he wouldn't have had any knowledge per se that they were in the area at the time. He knew that they had been investigating, and he also had been interviewed with them, but their movements and actions, he wouldn't have been privy to that. So he wouldn't have even known necessarily that they were in the area at the time, because they speak about it in the files, how they would go to lengths to, try and conceal the fact that they were picking around, because they didn't want word to get out. They wanted to be able to, really try and listen in and feel people out in the town and see what was going on. So I think that's why Mr. Dean wasn't aware that they were in town at the time. Otherwise, I think he would have went directly to them.
Lance, you talk about a conversation that happened between Mr. Dean and Miss Morrison. Ryan, was that the conversation, refresh my memory, was that the conversation where there was potentially people heard in the woods listening to that conversation?
Well, it's interesting. I'm glad you brought that up. So what happened was the day of the murder, Mrs. Morrison showed up at the Dean farm. She was collecting money for the local hospital. So she showed up on a visit hoping to get a donation. And so Mr. Dean, being a very gracious, generous person, he visited with her. He took her in his house and grabbed an antique off the mantle that she could auction off and gave it to her. And he knew that she was a Boston person who was a summer person for Jaffrey. So he knew that she regularly went back and forth. And he also knew that she was very interested in the lights as well, as was he. So because he knew that she went back and forth from Boston, I think he saw that opportunity. And he had obviously just found something out revelatory. So he decided to ask her, are you going back to Boston anytime soon? And she said, well, I'm going to Boston tomorrow. And he said, well, I need you to have the DOJ send their best agent because I have something to tell them. And it's so dangerous. I can't even tell you about it because I don't want to put you in danger. So now during that conversation, there very well could have been somebody listening in, but there wasn't any rustling or in the woods. The conversation you're thinking of was actually after the murder at the same location on Dean's farm. She was there talking to another gentleman, I believe it was a Mr. Anderson. And as they were talking on the Dean farm, they heard a rustling in the bushes and then saw a gentleman pop up and start running away. And so that was 3 days after the murder on August 16th, I believe it was. So sometimes those two things get confused because the situations are so similar, but the rustling in the bushes and the gentleman kind of popping up and running away, that was 3 days after the murder.
That's fantastic. One of the things that we've learned to do is admit when we've put out inaccurate information just based on what we've heard, and B, get people on such as yourself to set the story straight. That is a misconception. Knowing the case for several years myself, that is a misconception that I think I just drew together in my head as well, that the conversation between Miss Morrison and Mr. Dean happened and there was a rustling in the woods, but it was Miss Morrison and you said Mr. Anderson.
Yeah, your memory sort of places it together in a more salacious way.
It's very easy for something like that to happen because there is so many people involved. There's so much information. This is such a dense, complex story that it's very easy for things like that to, for even myself or for anyone, to have something like that happen because it's just such a complex case. So, these things happen, but that's why, it's good. We have our sources there and we can ultimately back up what we say with our sources. So, that's why we do the research so we can figure it out and make sure we have everything straight.
One of the things that kind of hung over me after putting out the first episode was Mrs. Dean and where she pointed that night. Those people, you can't get there unless you walk on top of the trees. That direction. Lance and I talked about on the first episode, what if she saw something in that direction that next morning to point her there? Like did she just pull that out of the air, or was that something, did she actually see something there?
Yeah, I mean, well, I think the difficulty with all of the kind of testimony and the information about Mrs. Dean the morning after is that, first and foremost, Mrs. Dean had dementia or some form of mental illness at the time. So, she was coherent, but at the same time, she was prone to, prone to kind of different kind of, I don't know how you would word it, but she was prone to go off a little bit mentally. So it's the difficulty with Mrs. Dean with her and the things that she said is that, we have to look at everything she said through that lens where, there's always the chance that something she was saying or the way she chose to communicate that, could be different than someone obviously that isn't suffering from that sort of condition. So she did reference the trees and things off in the distance, but it's really hard to make of what exactly that was.
Right. Like she wasn't saying literally you have to go walk on top of the trees because that's not really possible. But do we know the direction that she was pointed? And is that direction the way that someone who killed Mr. Dean would have been going?
I believe that the direction she did point in was in the direction of the barn where Mr. Dean was killed. I believe so. But I really just, and this is just my opinion from everything that I've seen, I don't think that Mrs. Dean saw anything. Personally, I don't believe that because there's a lot of evidence that whoever went there and committed the murder was familiar with the property and they were familiar with where Mrs. Dean would have been in her house and where the barn was. And there's a lot of evidence that the murderers were very familiar with the lay of the land. So it appears that whoever did this, they knew how to get onto the farm through the back trail or a back road. And so it would have been very easily for the murderers or murderer to get on the farm, go to the barn, kill Mr. Dean, and then slip out into the woods back to the road. And Mrs. Dean would have never known because she was in the bungalow, which is a good distance away from the barn and the big house where the cistern was, where Mr. Dean was dropped into. So there's always the chance, and from what I've seen, I don't think that Mrs. Dean witnessed anything personally.
You spoke about the murder party having to be familiar with the property, and that does make sense because this murder took place between 11:30 and 12:30. You'd imagine 11:30, 12:30. Yep. So it's definitely dark outside. You're talking, it's out there. Even today, it's out there. Like the dark is really dark out there. They would have had to have known where the cistern was because the walk from the barn to the big house and the cistern wasn't a direct route, and that cistern wasn't raised. People hear cistern and well, and I think they think they're the same thing. Well, you picture with the the bucket and the little house over it. The cistern was just raised brick, right? A circle of brick with a.
At the time there was a little rim of stone around it at the top, but that was it. There was just a small rim of stone and then a cover on top of it at the time.
And how far of a walk or carrying a body to this place would it have been?
From the barn where we believe he was murdered, it was about 100 feet, approximately 100 feet, not very far. But as you did know, if you were there at night and you didn't know the cistern was there, there's no way you would have seen it because the barn was on a slightly lower elevation as well as being over 100 feet away or approximately 100 feet away. So the line of view, and it's very close to the large house. So between it being pitch black at night out there and being so close to the house and not really rising much off of the ground, just having a small stone layer around it, you would have had to have known it was there in order to access it. And then another thing I should note that is after Coffelt was asked to leave Mr. Dean's house, he received a threatening letter in June, which stated that he should keep quiet about the lights or he would end up in the well.
Wow, do they know who wrote that?
They don't know who wrote it. he received it in his mailbox. It wasn't sent by postage. It was somebody pulled up to his mailbox on the dirt road and just slid it in there. And unfortunately, he talked about the note or the letter. He actually went to the local police and asked about getting protection after he received the letter. But he never figured out who wrote it. And that was one of the things, is after he was murdered, people were looking around the house and also hoping that it might be in his safety deposit box at the bank, but it was never located. So that's one of the mysteries, is where did the threatening note go, because it was never recovered.
That also answers something that has just been like a rock in my shoe about the whole case, which is they did such a disturbingly efficient job of making sure he was dead. There was really no reason to throw him in the well.
Yeah, there really wasn't. It was overkill, and this is only my opinion or my theory, but I think that he was killed in the way he was because they were trying to send a signal to people that, this is an assassination. This is, and they wanted to instill fear in other people in the area. Hey, if you talk, you're going to end up like this. So I think that's why it was so over the top, the murder, because they really wanted to make sure he was dead and make it clear to people that it was brutal and that there was danger.
Was Coffelt in town that day? Was he interviewed the next day? Like, he obviously would have been the most likely suspect, right?
Yeah. Well, here's what's interesting is that after Mr. Dean asked Coffelt to leave, Coffelt went and rented a new house in Temple, New Hampshire, the Temple Greenville area, which is about 10, 15 minutes from Jaffrey, very close by. And this house also was on a pretty significant elevation as well. And so, but what is interesting is, as I mentioned earlier, Coffelt started getting nervous as the suspicion of him being a spy continued to ramp up, and now Mr. Dean asked him to leave. So he was aware Mr. Dean was suspicious of him. So Coffelt, though he had the house in Temple, he went and got a job at the Portsmouth Naval Yard, and he had just established a room in Portsmouth at the hotel the day before the murder. So basically, he arrived in Portsmouth to start working on the 12th, and then the day later, Mr. Dean was murdered. So if we're looking at him as a suspect, he went out and established an alibi, and then the following day, Mr. Dean was murdered.
Now, I know that drive today is like 40-50 minutes from Portsmouth to Jaffrey, but back in 1919, something I realized after we spoke, Lance, is that must have been a lot longer than that. It must have been probably at least a 2-hour drive back then in his car. Is there any evidence to support that he made that drive back and forth that night?
Well, what they looked into it thoroughly. His car, Coffelt's car, was allegedly at the mechanics in, I believe, Nashua, New Hampshire. And they even went and interviewed the mechanic, and they testified that Coffelt's car was there the whole weekend and the engine was taken apart, and so he couldn't have had his car. So it covered him as far as him traveling back from Portsmouth to Jaffrey with his own car, but he could have easily rented a car or been picked up by someone else. So they did look into it, but they really couldn't one way or the other. They knew that Coffelt got out of work at about 6 or 7 o'clock that night, and then he was back in to work the next morning at probably around 6 or 7 a.m., but they had no way to really verify whether he left the hotel in Portsmouth or not the night of the murder.
He didn't have a black eye by any chance, did he?
No, he didn't. Mr. Rich did, but not Coffelt.
So then Mr. Rich was one of the people that the townsfolk looked at because of that black eye?
Yeah, well, Mr. Rich was a good friend of Mr. Dean. He was affluent local citizen, banker, judge, senator. And so the following day of after Mr. Dean was murdered and was found, he turned up with a mysterious black eye, which he gave a number of different explanations for. And so I think the thing that started to make people suspect him was obviously the black eye, and he was a bit nervous and vague about it and gave different descriptions about it. So when he showed up at Mr. Dean's house not long after they had discovered the body, he immediately tried to suggest it was suicide. Now, of course, we know by the way the body was found.
I'm sorry. Yeah,
that's ridiculous.
We can't let that go. I want to make sure that we're saying we're all on the same page here. Mr. Rich, Charles Rich, shows up to the Dean property when they've already found the body with his quote beautiful black eye, which is one of the best statements I've heard about the black eye. He shows up. Was he alone?
I believe he went there with his wife and his wife's sister, Georgiana Hodgkins. So I believe he showed up with them or with a lot of people that were involved with the town. The word was getting out. And so people were kind of showing up throughout the day as this was unfolding. And so he showed up and immediately suggested that it was suicide. And, the people that had pulled the body out said, well, yeah, we don't think that's the case with, judging from the condition of the body. So
had he known, so Charles Rich comes up, had not seen the body yet, and says, well, it just makes sense that William Dean has killed himself.
He made some comments to a number of people mentioned it in the grand jury hearing that he made comments right off the bat about it being suicide. And then once they basically pointed out to him that it couldn't have been because of the condition of the body, he pretty much started to gravitate towards the Mrs. Dean as the culprit. And there was a lot of talk of whether Mrs. Dean could have been capable of doing the murder with her mental condition. So that's very suspect to me that he shows up with the black eye, immediately suggests it's suicide, even though it's completely unfeasible due to the condition of the body. And then soon as that explanation doesn't work, then it goes right over to focusing on Mrs. Dean.
That's absurd. Mrs. Dean, she didn't happen to be built like Ronda Rousey, was she? Like, she's not going to be able to kill Mr. Dean and then carry him 50 to 100 feet by herself and drop him in the cistern, right? It's physically not possible that she did this, right?
Well, there was a lot of debate amongst the city councilor and the sheriff and the people investigating. This was a theory that the local law enforcement seemed to be coalescing around, but eventually that got put to bed because initially they only did a partial autopsy, but I believe it was January, so about 6 months later, they finally brought in George Burgess McGrath, who was a legendary forensic coroner at the time from Boston, and they brought him in to do an autopsy. And they also talked to him about whether or not it was feasible for Mrs. Dean to have committed the murder and done the brutal murder, carried the body, done all of the things. And he determined that he didn't think it was possible at all. And so once Burgess McGrath chimed in on the theory, finally that started to get kind of poo-pooed and winded down because that was something that a lot of the people had been trying to focus on.
Who were the other people who were focusing on this?
Well, I mean, I know it was tossed around by County Solicitor Pickard.
Guilty.
The local, the local affluent business people who are coming to Mr. Rich's defense. I mean, basically anybody that was either friends with Mr. Rich or part of the local authorities that were looking into it, they seem to be gravitating towards the Mrs. Dean theory up until McGrath weighed in on it.
Insanity.
Now, Mr. Dean had, Well, first, before I get into this, we are coming up on about an hour's worth of this, and I have to pat all of us on the back here and congratulate us by really, really walking the line between falling into the pit and with too much information and clearly talking about this case on a broad strokes level, because once we do start really talking about this, we introduce amazing characters. We introduce these little instances that have gone undocumented or unsolved, and when we first started talking about Charles Rich, I was wondering if we should even start talking about him, because it is, you start getting into the fact that he visited the Rich family the night before, and the accounts of that visit vary depending on what you're reading. Whether you're reading the book by Georgiana Hodgkins or you're reading the court transcripts. It varies. Charles Rich's description of the horse kicking him, the milk pail that hasn't been found still, and the items that he brought back to the house that night that apparently Mrs. Rich packaged up for Mrs. Dean and Mr. Dean to bring back. There's so much stuff you can get into here. It's like a big crock pot of stew.
It is.
Well, what's the connection between Coffelt and Rich? Because we're talking about two guys who seem guilty as hell, but could they have been in on this together in some way?
Well, it's interesting because when you look at the different testimony by Coffelt and Rich, whether it's the grand jury hearing testimony or the actual interviews that were conducted by the DOJ, there's a lot of discrepancy in the sense that in certain interviews or areas, Mr. Rich really kind of downplays being friends with Coffelt, or, oh yeah, I knew him because, he did business at the bank and, he lived at the Dean farm. So in certain, depending where you look, it's kind of downplayed that he knew Coffelt well, but then in other areas when you read about it, it seems that they I don't know that they were as good of friends as Mr. Rich and Mr. Dean were, but Mr. Rich definitely knew Coffelt, and I think tried to downplay a bit how well he knew him, from what I've seen. So there's the obvious connection that Mr. Rich was the local banker, so Coffelt would have been doing business with him on a regular basis at the bank, and so that was their main connection, other than the fact that Coffelt lived at the Deans and Mr. Rich was good friends with Mr. Dean.
If you're looking at Coffelt and Rich in front of you, and they're there at night, and one of them's your friend, and one of them's this guy you just kicked off your property, and you got one punch to throw before you get taken down by these two, who are you going to punch, your friend or the guy that you already don't like?
Yeah, no, you're right. Well, and as we mentioned, Mr. Dean was a boxer. And so, we can only speculate on what happened in the barn that night, but, they very well could have, whether it was Mr. Rich by himself or Coffelt was there or whoever was there, there very well probably was a conversation between Mr. Rich and Mr. Dean about what he was going to reveal, because he had just requested for Mrs. Morrison to get the agent. And Mr. Dean was very patriotic. So if he found out that Mr. Rich was wrapped up in anything, I could, from everything I've read about Mr. Dean, I could see it totally being in the realm of possibility, being a boxer and being so patriotic and being appalled by what he was hearing or being asked to keep quiet. I could see it being very feasible that he hauled off and got Rich with a good one. So
I found something that I just want to close with, and it's the testimony, part of the testimony from, I didn't realize what Miss Morrison's full name was, and she has probably one of the coolest full names in this whole case. Aria Fraser Cotton Morrison is her full name. And she speaks of the time when William Dean told her about asking or evicting the Coffelt family. And he said, "I knew just a little too much. I gave them 24 hours to get out. And she says she remembers those words absolutely. I gave them 24 hours to get out. He said, I am too good an American to keep people of that kind on my place.